Am I on? Thank you. Can you hear me now? Good to see everybody. Hadn't seen, last time I saw you it was wintertime. Yeah, yesterday was first day of spring. And glad to see you and glad to see everybody who's tuning in on YouTube. One of those folks, I want to say a special hello to Gerald Smith. I mentioned Gerald last week, who was having knee surgery, and he got through the surgery very well. He is back in Lexington taking rehab. So Gerald, we hope and pray you'll continue to improve. And I know he's with us because he checked with me today to see exactly what passages we'd be covering tonight. And also, a lot of you know Sybil Ray Fennell. And Sybil Ray was always faithful to come to the Bible study. She's at the hospice house over in Winston. And we want to be remembering her. And there are a lot of folks that we need to remember. And of course, our situation in the world, we continue to pray. Let's pause for a moment. Dear God, we thank you for the changing of the seasons and for the beauty of a new day, the beauty of a new season. But we're mindful that you are the same in season and out of season, in times of peace and in times of war, in times of sickness and in times of health. We can always depend on your love and your grace. We especially pray tonight for all of those who are suffering. There are those who are suffering physically because of an illness, but there are also those who are suffering because of a terrible conflict that is totally unnecessary. If only the hearts of men could be changed and the spirits of men could be in tune with your spirit. We know that you have all power, and we pray that you would intercede and that you would bring peace to our world that is needed so desperately. For the good news of the gospel and for Paul's epistle to the Romans, we give you thanks tonight. In Christ's name, amen. Have you noticed that Paul talks a whole lot about the law? He's really big in the law. So why is the law of God so important? Well, I just want to share a couple of verses with you. You know both of them very well. The first one is in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the ordinances which the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess. That you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's son, by keeping all of his statutes and his commandments, which I command you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. And the opening words to the book of Psalms. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord. And on his law he meditates day and night. So do you see why the Jews would have been shocked when Paul wrote the words, "But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law"? Because the law was everything to the Jewish people. And in Romans 3:21, what we're going to look at tonight is Romans 3:21 through the end of that chapter. And I'm just going to mention the 4th chapter. But you see, the law of God is everything, but what Paul is saying is that the righteousness of God comes about apart from the law. Now, I want us to do two things. Number one, I kind of want us to go up to about 10,000 feet and look down and get the big picture. Then we're going to go to ground level. We're going to look at some things very closely. Well, actually, I want us to do three things, because then I want us to take some picks and shovels, and I want us to dig down beneath the surface. So let's look at the big picture. Paul is doing two things from the beginning of Romans through the end of the 4th chapter. In Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18 up to the 20th verse of the 3rd chapter, he is describing the human condition. And the human condition is simply, we're all sinners. That's the common denominator that binds us together, the sinfulness of humanity. Now, beginning in the 21st verse of the 3rd chapter, he's going to talk about the divine remedy. So you got the human condition, that we're sinners. Now we have the divine remedy, which is the righteousness of God. What he does is, beginning in the 21st verse of the 3rd chapter, going through the end of that chapter, he's going to state the principle of the righteousness of God. That's the theory. But beginning in the 4th chapter, the whole 4th chapter, he's going to give us an example of the righteousness of God that is apart from the law. And the example he gives us is Abraham. Now, why would Abraham be a good example of righteousness apart from the law? Think about it for a minute. Because when Abraham lived, there was no law. It was a long time before the law, before Moses. And so Abraham was counted righteous, but there was no law. So he's the perfect example of this. What I want us to do now is, well, let's come down from 10,000 feet to about 1,000 feet. And let's look at verses 21 through 26. This is going to be our primary focus. There is a logic to these verses. The concept is the righteousness of God. And this is what he says. Here's the logic. The righteousness of God is apart from the law. He states that in verse 21. Secondly, he said, even though it's apart from the law, it's witnessed to by the law and the prophets. That's at the end of the 21st verse. And then in the 22nd verse, the righteousness of God comes through faith in Christ Jesus for all who believe. And then the final thing is, it is the righteousness of God comes in the 24th verse. In 23rd verse, he says, we're all sinners. We're all in the same boat. So the answer is that we are justified by his grace. It is a gift through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus. The point is, we've all sinned. Everybody. So therefore, we all must be justified. We all must be made right with God. But it comes about through God's grace as a gift for both Jew and Gentile. You know, the interesting thing is, the remedy of God, which is his righteousness, Paul is saying this is separate from the law, but yet it fulfills the law. Everything the law talked about, everything the law helped people to do, the way God wanted them to live, all of that, the fulfillment of all that comes in the righteousness of God, which is achieved not through the law, but apart from the law, if that makes any sense. Let's come a little bit closer now. Let's go to ground level. And let's look at verses 25 and 26. The focus is on Christ. And what Paul does, he answers three questions: what, how, and why. What? The what is the gift of God, the grace of God, God put forward. It is within the divine. For Jesus to come and to die on the cross is the plan of God. And that's why you have the words at the beginning of the 25th verse, whom God put forward. There's one thing that's very clear in all four Gospels. Jesus did not lose his life. He gave his life. And there is a big difference. Jesus was not an unfortunate victim of circumstance. He wasn't a nice guy who got in over his head. He just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. I'll give you a good example of that. If you turn over to the 18th chapter of John, this is after the upper room. When they had left the upper room. And by the way, those of you that have been to Israel, you can kind of picture this in your mind, because we go, they don't have the original upper room. It's long gone. But we know about where it was located. And they have a place called the upper room that would have looked like the room. We know about where it was located in Jerusalem. So when they left the upper room that night, and remember, I think it's Mark that says they had a closing hymn. They probably sang, "Blessed be the tie." Maybe not. But they had a closing hymn. They left. Where did they go? They crossed over the Kidron Valley, and they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. And there's you all that have been there, remember when we went to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest? Remember, that's where they had the pit. But you can stand there and you can look at Jerusalem and you can say, now, the upper room was up there, and then there was a path that went right beside the house of the high priest, went down into the valley, went across the valley, and over there is a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. It's still there today. There are olive trees there that are over 1,000 years old today. That's where Jesus was when this happened. So the beginning of the 18th chapter, he leaves with his disciples. They go across the Kidron Valley. There was a garden. Now Judas, who had betrayed him, he knew the place. So Judas had gone, and if you're open to John 18, look at the 3rd verse. He had a band of soldiers. He had officers from the chief priest and the Pharisees. I mean, he had all the muscle. These guys had the weapons. Nobody could have defeated these guys. They had lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, who knew what was going on, came up to them and asked the question, "Whom do you seek?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And you see how Jesus answered them? He said, "I am." And what happened to all of the soldiers, to all of the people who had come to arrest him? Look at what it says. They drew back and they fell to the ground. Any question who's in charge here? Jesus did not lose his life. He gave his life. Remember that old gospel song, "He could have called 10,000 angels." Y'all remember that? Or is that just an old Alabama song? Anybody ever heard of that? Yeah. Pat, I'm glad you have. Okay, I got a few here. Ramona, it's an oldie goldie. But the concept of that is so very true. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he didn't, because he was giving his life. And that's exactly what Paul is saying in Romans 3. God, whom God put forward. That is the what. The how is, how did he do this? How did he accomplish this? It was his death upon the cross. He was obedient unto death, so it talks about his blood in verse 25. Why did God do this? Look at verse 26. God acted this way to prove the divine righteousness. To prove at the present time that he is righteous. So basically, verse 25 is saying that Christ's death upon the cross is the sign that God is righteous. But verse 26 is saying that through Christ's death upon the cross, God will make all of those who have faith. You see in verse 26, he himself is righteous, and that he justifies him who has faith in Jesus. And by the way, next week we're going to talk about what does it mean to have faith. We'll talk about that in more detail next Monday. Now, we've been up, we've come down, we've been at ground level. Now we're going to do some digging. Now we're going to dig really deep. And it's one word in verse 25 of Romans 3. Let me read it from the old duct tape version. And I guarantee you, unless you have the RSV, you're going to have a different word. My Bible says, whom God put forward as an expiation by his blood. What do you have, Ann? Sacrifice. Of atonement. Okay, good. Sacrifice of atonement. Or some translations say atoning sacrifice. Anybody have a King James? What does it say, Thee? It's not a word we use every day. Instead of expiation, propitiation. Anybody know what that means? See, that's part of, and then atoning sacrifice. Are there any other words that you have? Another translation would be sacrifice of reconciliation. Well, let's go back to the old translations where the King James had propitiation, but the RSV has expiation. What do those words even mean? Expiation implies that the sacrifice that is made on our behalf affects a change in human beings. In other words, when we see what God has done for us in Christ, when we look at the magnitude of his suffering death upon the cross, and we realize he did that for me, the way that I respond to that, it changes my behavior. That is expiation. One of the best examples I know of that is if you ever saw the movie Saving Private Ryan. You see that? It's a tough movie to watch, but it's a great, great movie. The movie is roughly based on a true story in which there is a family, the Ryan family. They have 4 boys who are fighting in the war. 3 of the brothers are already killed. And the word comes after D-Day that James Ryan is missing. They don't know if he's dead or alive. And the word goes to General George Marshall when he realizes that here this one family has already lost 3 of their sons, and there's the possibility that the 4th son will not make it. And so he decides that they have to get Private Ryan out of there safely, that this mother doesn't deserve to lose all 4 of her sons. So they send Captain John Miller, played by Tom Hanks, on a special mission to save Private Ryan. The movie opens, there is an older man who kind of looks like me, some old guy, and he and his family, why are you laughing, honey?
I haven't said a word.
Okay. You know, when I first saw the movie, I said, that guy's really old. And I looked, the last time I saw it, I said, he's not that old. But he's probably, I'm sure in his 70s, maybe even his 80s, I don't know, but it's toward the end of his life. And his family has brought him over to Germany or someplace where there's an American cemetery. And at the beginning of the movie, he walks up to the grave of Captain John Miller. And he's standing over the grave, and then he goes back, and it begins with D-Day. It's a tough movie to watch. It's very graphic. But the story is that Tom Hanks, John Miller, and this special crew, they risk their lives. Several lost their lives to save his. And at the very end of the movie, Tom Hanks is injured, and he's on a bridge, and he's dying. And Private Ryan is standing over him, watching him die. And Captain Miller looks up at him and he says, "Earn this. Earn this." And in the closing scene, he's the old man again, and he's standing over his grave, and he's saying, "I hope you think I've earned it." It changed the way he lived, because he saw a man die to save his life, and it changed his life. That is a perfect example of expiation. When I'm so moved by the sacrifice of someone else, it changes my behavior. Now let's talk about that other word, propitiation. It's a little bit different. I think that was my phone going off, so I'll silence it. Propitiation implies a change in God's disposition toward humanity. Let me give you an example of that. And we talked about this a few weeks ago, but if you go back to the flood story, beginning in the 6th chapter of Genesis, it begins by talking about the sinfulness of humanity. That's what set off the flood. In Genesis chapter 6, the 5th verse, it said, "The Lord saw the wickedness of man was great, that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually." No question. Sinfulness, man was messed up, evil continually. Now, then, of course, God saw Noah. He found favor. God said, how about building a boat? You can make it through. We all know that story. But let's go to the end of the flood. Flood's over. In the 8th chapter, beginning in the 20th verse, Noah builds an altar in which he's giving sacrifice. He's thanking God that they survived. And it said, the Lord smelled the pleasing odor of the sacrifice, and he said, I will never again curse the ground because of man, because the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. There's not a whole lot of difference in that and before the flood. The point is, humanity was evil before the flood, humanity was evil after the flood. So what changed? Gene, you just jumped right to the conclusion. Jesus. The next time, instead of saying, why don't you build a boat and you can make it through, God sends the boat. In fact, the word for the ark is the word tava, T-A-V-A. There's only one other place that it's used. By the way, the Ark of the Covenant, that ark is a different word. Remember when Moses' mother built the little basket? The word is tava. She actually built a little ark to save Moses. And the word tava can be translated logos, word. In the beginning was the Word. So what changed was now God sends His Son to become the salvation. It's kind of going full circle. So you see there's a subtle difference between expiation and propitiation. But now here comes, we're going to dig even deeper. There's a second question. Is this word a noun or an adjective? And you say, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is sacrificial atonement. According to that, that would be an adjective. Sacrificial atonement, it becomes an adjective of how God achieved atonement. I'll give you another example. Anybody heard of Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian? I want to tell you something. In my Thursday morning group, I asked about that, and I said, does anybody here have the complete works of Josephus? I have a copy. It's a lot bigger than that Bible. I mean, it's huge. Ralph Ashley not only has a copy, he's read the whole thing. I said, Ralph, I can't believe that. You actually read the complete works of Josephus? So, wow, I'm impressed. Well, anyway, there's a story. You know old King Herod, you know, the bad guy, the guy that killed all the little babies after Jesus was born. One day he decided that he was going to plunder King David's tomb. Of course, King David was one of would be the patron saint of Jerusalem. So, in fact, if you go to Israel today, you all remember there's a tomb of David. I doubt if he's really there, but there's still a tomb of David. So King Herod decides there's probably gold in there and all kind of artifacts. So he decides, I'm going to go in there and plunder the grave, see what I can get. So he has bodyguards with him, he always does. When they got close to the tomb of David, they were immediately consumed by fire. And old King Herod said, uh-oh, I think I messed up. I should not go any further. And he didn't. But then he decided, he said, you know, David's God is pretty angry with me right now. So what I'll do is I'll build a memorial kind of to make atonement for my sin. So he built a memorial at the tomb of David, and it was called this is really a tongue twister, a propitiatory memorial. In other words, a sacrificial memorial, a memorial that was to atone for his sins of disturbing the grave of Israel's greatest king. So if we say sacrificial atonement or sacrificial reconciliation, we're using it as an adjective. But now it really gets interesting. Turn over to the 25th chapter of Exodus. This is when God instructed Moses to have the people to build a sanctuary, a dwelling place for himself. In 25:8 of Exodus, let them make a sanctuary that I may dwell in your midst. The Ark of the Covenant, if you recall, symbolized the very presence of God. The Hebrew people were very literal people. They didn't do well with symbolism and metaphors and things like that. So that when they were wandering in the wilderness, and one of them said, wonder where God is. One of them said, well, he's over there. See the tent? That's the tabernacle, and there's the ark in there, and that's where God is. And they'd say, okay, just so he hasn't left us. They had to actually see. That's what the Ark of the Covenant was all about. And you remember what they put in the ark? The main thing they put in the ark was the 10 Commandments. I mean, you know, Moses messed up the first copy and went and got a second copy. They put it in there. And there were all kind of stuff. They even said there was some manna in the Ark of the Covenant. Probably spoiled after 1,000 years, but it was supposed to be in there. So he goes into all of this detail beginning in the 10th verse about how they should make it. He talks about acacia wood, talks about the length, talks about overlaying it with gold and all of this. But if you go down to the 16th verse, he talks about you put rings on it, then you put poles in the rings for men to carry it, because as you know, no one could touch the Ark of the Covenant. Why? They would die. So they had these poles they carried it with. All of these details are here. But then he said in verse 16, and you shall put into the ark the testimony that I shall give you, the 10 Commandments. Then you shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. Anybody have another word than mercy seat?
And atonement cover.
Atonement cover. The word is propitiation. The covering over the ark was called the propitiation. You say, well, why? Well, read on down. Look at verse 21. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and then you're going to put the 10 Commandments in there. But look at verse 22. There I will meet you. And from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are upon the ark of testimony, I will speak to you. Where will God meet us? At the mercy seat. Where will he speak to us? At the mercy seat. The propitiation. So once a year, on the Day of Atonement, on the day that all of the people of God could have their sins forgiven, there were animals that were sacrificed. And the high priest would take the blood of one of the lambs and would actually go into the Holy of Holies. Only one man could go in one time a year, the high priest. And when he went into the Holy of Holies, he would sprinkle that blood on top of the Ark of the Covenant, the propitiation, so that humanity and God could be reconciled. And if you go to the book of Hebrews, in the 9th chapter, it talks about this, and it talks about the fact that Christ becomes our mercy seat, that he becomes the propitiation. It's down in, it describes in chapter 9, verses 11 and following, and it talks about the day that the high priest goes in there, the sprinkling of blood. And it said, if the blood of goats and bulls will bring about, the forgiveness of sin, look at the verse 14, how much more shall the blood of Christ, through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify you? Well, you think we've gone down far enough? Isn't that just, to me, it's just fascinating. It is really, really something. So the blood of Christ becomes the manifestation of the righteousness of God. And how do we receive this righteousness? Well, go back to Romans chapter 3. There's one word, and that word is faith. It's at the end of the 26th verse. That he will justify the one who has faith in Jesus. Faith is our response to the gift of God. We are not saved by faith. We're saved by God. But faith is our reception of God's gift of salvation. Next week, we're going to look at that verse in Ephesians, by grace are you saved through faith. So faith is not a work. Faith is not being able to keep the law. Faith is our acceptance of God's grace. There was a theologian whose name was Paul Tillich. When I was in school, just the mention of the name Paul Tillich would bring about all type of perturbations, propitiations, and expiations. We would be trembling in our boots. This guy was impossible. And I've asked some people that have been in seminary within the last 20 years, do you all study Paul Tillich? And they'll say, who? But anyway, I thought Paul Tillich was a heavy theologian, but he was a great, great preacher. And he preached a sermon one time simply titled, You Are Accepted. I want to read this to you, and then I have a story to tell you. Sometimes at that moment, a wave of light breaks into our darkness, and it is as though a voice were saying, You are accepted. You are accepted. Accepted by that which is greater than you, and the name of which you do not know. Do not ask for that name now. Perhaps you will find it later. Do not try to do anything now. Perhaps later you will do much. Do not seek for anything. Do not perform anything. Do not intend anything. Simply accept the fact that you are accepted. And if we can do that, if that happens to us, we experience grace. After such an experience, we may not be better than before, we may not believe more than before, but everything is transformed. In that moment, grace conquers sin, and reconciliation bridges the gulf of estrangement. And nothing is demanded of this experience, no religious or moral or intellectual presupposition, nothing but acceptance. Think about how different the world would be if we would simply learn that we are accepted. Not by what we do, not by what we've accomplished, but because we're a child of God. And think about what a difference it would make if we would look at other people and instead of judging them, we would just say, they are accepted. I mentioned last week the fact that I was never much of an athlete. And I mentioned, when your football coach comes to you and say, Howell, I think you could run the clock. That's a pretty good sign, Dale, that, yep, I'm not going to be sitting on the bench anymore. But actually, my coach came to me, and it was a game in which we had an ancient clock operator. The guy must have been 90 years old, and he couldn't see. And we were driving late in the first half, and he just let the time run off. Coach wasn't real happy about that, and that was when he decided I didn't need to sit on the bench anymore. I could be a clock operator. So he brought me this stuff. He said, study this, you're having a test tomorrow. So I studied it, and then the next day I took a test, and then he came and presented me two things. One is, and I still have it, from the Alabama High School Athletic Association. This certifies that Ray Howell is a registered football electric clock operator. Not just a clock operator, I was an electric clock operator. Yeah, well, my brother John said that thing belongs in the Smithsonian. It probably does. And by the way, the executive secretary of the Alabama High School Athletic Association was Bubba Scott. How you like that? Bubba. Bubba was his name. So the next Friday night, now you've got to get this picture. He not only gave me this card, but he also gave me a referee's uniform, because now I was the clock operator. And the next Friday night, so, the week before, I'm nobody. I don't even get a good place on the bench. The next Friday night, the referees, you know how they go out to the middle of the field, do the coin toss? I'm walking out there with the referees. And when our captains get out there, one of them punches, that's Howell over there. And then they say, we're in good shape now. So all of a sudden, I was accepted. And then there is one more thing about this. Y'all seen the movie Woodlawn? Brian, you seen that movie Woodlawn? It's about the Alabama, and the recruiting, the big high school football game that they have. Y'all have got to see that movie. It's one of the best movies. It's a Christian movie. It's Woodlawn. It's about two high schools in the state of Alabama that were arch rivals, that hated each other. And anyway, at Woodlawn, this guy shows up, and he's part of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes or something like that. Anyway, to make a long story short, a revival sort of takes place with that football team. And then it carried over to the other football team. And before their senior season, these guys that went on to play for Alabama and won national championship, they actually had their preseason camp together, those two teams, because they had learned to respect each other. It all builds up to the battle for the state championship to the final game for the state championship that was at Legion Field in Birmingham that can seat 75,000 at the time. And there were so many people that showed up at the game. They kept delaying the kickoff because they couldn't get all the people in. They didn't have enough staff. And most all the Southeastern Conference coaches were there. Bear Bryant was there, Shug Jordan from Auburn, all the big name football coaches were there to see this game. Well, I was in college at the time, and I decided that I wanted to go see that game because that's all they were talking about. So I drove over, because I was in college at Samford, which was in Birmingham, and I drove over there, and I saw the crowd. And I said, there's no way. I mean, they're lined up, from here back past the Y. I'll never get in to see that game. And then I realized, I've got my card. I got my pass. So I went up to the press entrance, and I flashed this card. And next thing I knew, I was going up the elevator, and I was sitting in the press box with Bear Bryant and Shug Jordan. And if you see that, you've got to watch that movie. I mean, it is an incredible movie. But at the end of the movie, when they're showing the football game, I was there. I was there because now I was somebody. But you see, what Paul is saying is, you shouldn't have to have one of these. Or actually, everybody has one of these now. We're all accepted because we're all children of God. It doesn't matter whether you are all-American or not. It doesn't matter whether you have the ability or not. It doesn't matter if you've been able to keep the law or not. We all have the acceptance. And that's what the righteousness of God is all about. So you got to see that movie. Yeah, it's exciting. It's great. Woodlawn. Lawn. Yeah. And it is a true story all the way to, but I didn't see myself sitting in the press box. That was the only part about it that wasn't true.
Are you not afraid you'll lose that little card out of your pocket? Are you afraid you'll send it to the cleaners?
No, my brother sent me a message the other day, and I don't know how this came up, but he said, it's about like you finagling your way in that football game that night. And I said, what do you mean? I said, I got in because I had my pass, and I took a picture of it, and I sent it to him. I said, this is how I got in the game. And he said, that belongs in the Smithsonian.
I guess after that, the Bowens and Yellow Jacket press box was a little bit of a letdown for you.
Oh, yeah. Sure. I kept looking around for.
Maybe it could be good as Bowens did for sure.
Did you ever hear the Sarge Linder story?
Which one?
Sarge Linder. Did you know him? You remember a referee named Sarge Linder, Brian? Well, there was this guy that called games. His name was Sarge Linder. And when we would do a football game, if Harold didn't know, most of the time we tried to get the name of the referees, but if we didn't get them, the referee was always Sarge Linder. He just always used that name. Well, Sarge Linder was calling a game, I think in Thomasville one night, and that game got over quicker than ours, and so he turns on the radio, and he hears Harold say, and Sarge Linder just picked up the flag, and so it's late in the fourth quarter, we're up there, and all of a sudden the door opens to the press box, and Harold turns around and said, oh, Sarge Linder just walked in. And he said, well, I heard I was calling this game too, and I just wanted to see what was going on. There's another story about Harold Bowen that involves you. I'm saving it. Hey, I'm saving it for next week. It's a good one too. Okay, thank you all for